technology. I mean, I'm sure at Riverside you all have just had to cobble things together as well.
The learning curve is steep. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for
Now
sure.
I know how to turn off people's videos and
Right. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. The I tease our church folks because my favorite memory of this so far is I was teaching a Bible study like on a Sunday night or something. And it was a group of senior adults, and one lady ordered a webcam, and like it was very sweet. She was so excited about this, and she thought that the camera was the microphone. And so every now and then, all we would see was just these teeth, right here, where she would just ask questions, and it's like, oh, that's it's actually the camera. So I have also made similar mistakes. So
oh yeah, yeah. Um, I was doing a live interview with the book, and the mowers came, and I could just see them going by the window weed eating, and just this loud like just power on.
yeah, right, right. Hmm. Well, we are good on YouTube, and so I'll just say that if you've found this video, this is going to be our conversations that matter for tonight. And this is my friend Lynn Castile Harper, and we're on a little bit early just to give people time to find the video, and so we'll get started with our discussion in about 4 to 5 minutes or so. Um, yeah.
Great.
So, what is the weather like in Maine right now?
Cold, cold, cold.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
high of 20. So
yeah, yeah.
I'm sure in Winston, you have to have a light jacket, but
Yeah, it was 40s today, but it was raining the entire day almost. So, and we're in for that for a few days.
yep. And you guys get ice, if I recall.
Yes, and even worse than Southeast Missouri, when it ices, people really freak out on the roads, and so
Oh
yep.
my gosh.
Hmm.
Well, I remember not being accustomed to ice, and my first winter I slipped and went down an entire staircase in my apartment,
Oh,
like outdoor apartment on the ice. And I
oh
thought, oh.
no! Was this at the Baptist Student Center?
No, this was in Kernersville at our
Oh, okay,
apartment
yeah, yeah.
there. So it was more embarrassing for my ego than actually hurt myself.
Yeah. I'd say one of our guests on here is Amy Gallagher, who is our missions pastor, and she and her husband live in Kernersville.
Oh, great.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Good
for
memories.
that's right. And for anybody joining, this is our conversations that matter tonight, and we came on a little bit early just to let people find the video. This is my friend Lynn Castile Harper, and we are going to get started with our discussion in just a few minutes. So some folks are joining us on the Zoom webinar, and others are joining us on YouTube. And either way is totally fine. And Amy says that Kernersville rocks except when it's icy. Yeah.
Yeah. K Vegas, Amy, all the way.
Now, is Riverside doing anything in person right now?
Our food pantry is still open.
Mm-hmm.
So there's grab and go food throughout the week, and we have a COVID testing site.
Yeah.
But otherwise, no small groups, no worship on site. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's tough,
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But I'm, like I said earlier, I'm blessed with a congregation that seems to take this very seriously and seems to adhere very well to what's asked of us
Mm-hmm.
in loving
Yeah.
our community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have lots of colleagues who are not in that situation.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. People just rolled with it, and been faithful to each other, and it's quite incredible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got more joining us on YouTube and Zoom. And I just want to say that if you're just joining us, this is our Conversations That Matter. This is my friend Lynn Castile Harper, who I'll be speaking with tonight. And we're going to get started in just about 2 minutes or so. We just came on a little bit early so everyone could find the video and get it queued up. But we'll get started with our discussion. And if you have any questions, if you're joining us on the Zoom webinar, you can put those in the chat box. I've got a list of questions that I'll be asking Lynn, and we'll let that guide our conversation in just a little bit. Lynn, one memory I have, by the way, is there was some night where Caleb and Whitney and I went to your parents' house and we played Star Wars Monopoly, and you and Ryan had gotten everybody like space ice cream. And so that's a memory I have.
Gosh, thank you I had forgotten about that. Wow.
Small world.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I have so many memories of your family and your parents, and they're formative to me. Your whole family.
There's something.
They're formative to you.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. They may be watching tonight, by the way. So
oh, great.
Yeah,
great.
They won't watch if it was just me, but because it's Lynn and Tyler, they'll probably watch. Yeah. Well, I've got 7 o'clock, Lynn, and so I think we'll go ahead and get started. And so I want to say a word of welcome to everyone who's joining us, whether it is through Zoom or whether you are watching live on YouTube. I want to welcome you to our first Conversations That Matter. And so one of the things that has become very important to us at Ardmore Baptist Church is being able to find ways to engage in dialogue and conversations about topics that can be difficult to talk about. And so this year, every other month, we are hosting a time of dialogue with an author about a recent book of theirs that deals with a topic that enriches our understanding of what it means to be human and informs who we are as people of faith. And so I am so excited for our first Conversations That Matter. Our guest is Reverend Lynn Castile Harper, who is a friend of mine. From our lives have overlapped in many ways, and we'll probably talk about some of those tonight. But so Lynn Castile Harper serves as the minister of older adults at the Riverside Church in New York City. And prior to Riverside, she served as a nursing home chaplain for 7 years. And she graduated from Wake Forest University Divinity School. And before that, she graduated from the prestigious Southeast Missouri State University. Lynn completed her chaplaincy residency at Robert Wood Johnson University Medical Center in New Jersey. And she is the author of On Vanishing: Mortality, Dementia, and What It Means to Disappear. I know many of you have told me that you have gotten a copy of Lynn's book, that you've been reading it, and that you've also been finding it really beautiful, just as I have, and informative for what it means to reckon with dementia in our culture, and helps inform how we care for those around us with dementia. So Lynn is originally from Southeast Missouri, and she lives in both Maine and New York City with her husband, Ryan. And full disclosure, Ryan was a youth minister of mine when I was like a puny little 6th grader. And he never wore shoes. He never, ever wore shoes. Maybe now that he's graduated from, he's like a religion professor, maybe he wears shoes now. I don't know.
Only when he has to.
Only when he has to. Yeah, the man. So anyway, Lynn, thank you so much for being here, and I'm just delighted that you were able to make this work. And so If anybody does want to ask questions who's joining us on the Zoom webinar, I want you to know that we're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat box. I think that's going to be the easiest way to receive questions. And if you're joining us on YouTube, you can put questions in the comments. I can see the comments, and I'll try to keep my eye on those. But I have a list of questions that I wanted to start off with. Lynn, first, I just want to hear about your background, and I know you grew up in Southeast Missouri, but kind of what were formative experiences ministerially for you, and then how'd you end up in your current position?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just thank you for having me at Ardmore and for Conversations That Matter. And I just applaud you for living into this most difficult moment globally, nationally, and leaning into these difficult conversations. Now is as good a time, maybe better than any. So hats off to you, Reverend Tankersley. So, thank you. So what brought me to this place? Like Tyler said, I'm from Jackson, Missouri, about 100 miles south of St. Louis. And Tyler went to church right across the street from me. I was at the United Methodist Church, and he was at the rival First Baptist, which had a much bigger youth group.
I was going to say, you came to youth group quite a bit. So
I did. I started dating a Baptist, and the rest is history, I guess. But those were formative years in a very small town with, people were very religiously committed. I came from a family that wasn't particularly religious, but we, did our part in a small town to at least have a church. And I felt very drawn from an early age to ministry, kind of inexplicably, and became more involved in Baptist life and went to Southeast Missouri State, which Tyler as well knows about, the Baptist Student Center there. And those were formative years for me, working with Denise Lincoln and Andy Pratt, and just being empowered to see women in ministry and to dive in and do it myself. And went on to Wake Forest Divinity School in good old Winston-Salem. And it was there at Wake, some most profound moments, getting to work at Brook Ridge Retirement Community with two amazing chaplains there, Maurice Briggs and Ray Benefield. And they were retired pastors, chaplains, and just took me under their wing at age 24 and ushered me through those halls. And I got to know older people in a way that was very powerful. And there was a dementia unit there. And I can remember the chaplains just, they were so human and so real, and no one was treated as their disease. And so I learned a lot from that, but I didn't think that's where ministry would necessarily lead me forever, but it was a good intern year. And then after Div School, went up to New Jersey and completed chaplaincy residency and was exposed to, again, older people with chronic conditions, and some of whom had dementia. And felt very drawn to the population and seeing that they were often discarded or dismissed and their gifts not received. So after that chaplaincy training, I went on to become a chaplain at a retirement community. And that's really where this book was forged. My love of working with people with dementia and those years at that retirement community. And now find myself in a beautiful and large and diverse church, the Riverside Church, 1,600 members, and we're an interracial, interdenominational congregation in thriving Morningside Heights on the edge of Harlem. And I get to continue my work with amazing elders. So I'm just really, really grateful that my ministry path has led me in the direction of our most experienced members of the population. And I learn a lot every day from them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And tell me maybe what it's like ministering to that population during COVID, during the pandemic.
Yeah. So our building is closed, and so we're not meeting for worship. There's not really a safe way to do so at this moment. We've, like everyone, pivoted to Zoom, And every Thursday, our older adult group meets just like this, on Zoom together. And those who don't have internet access call in. And so we have a number of people call in. And so we're all there and pray together, continue with Bible study, do all the things we try to do in person. And this is, it's in some ways, and Tyler, you may have comment on this, it's a little bit second rate. It's not how I anticipate doing ministry. And yet, the way the Spirit moves is there's always opportunities and ways to care.
Yeah, I mean, if you had to choose a moment in human history for this to happen and to be trying to minister to folks, I would have chosen this moment with all of these ways to reach folks and engage in communication. So there are blessings in that for sure. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you about the title of the book, Lynn. The title of your book comes from maybe the idea of the way that we tend to talk about, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. A common phrase is it's the long goodbye. And you write this in the book. Persons with dementia are so readily envisioned as vanished or vanishing, succumbing to an especially terrifying, slow-moving, unstoppable vortex of suffering, surely speaks to anxieties beyond the ordinary fears of death and disease. So just kind of a basic question is, why do you think we have such a heightened sense of fear about dementia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from what I read, it's Alzheimer's, which is the most common form of dementia, is the most feared disease in America. So people are concerned about getting cancer, but they're really fearful in a visceral way about having some form of dementia. And I think that says a lot about our culture. We live in a culture that's pretty harsh on disability, whether that's cognitive or physical, but particularly cognitive, because we're a culture with a foundational myth that we should be independent, self-sufficient, that we should be able to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And so there's that real strong sense that when we have need, or when we're not able to do the things we once did, that somehow we failed. And we failed, not just failed at an ability or something we can do, but failed as a person. And so that's a pretty harsh environment to grow up in, but we do. And so we kind of absorb those messages that we are what we do. And so dementia really kicks that up into high gear, because most of the people who have dementia need help, rely on others for daily tasks, and as the illness progresses, more and more. So there is a lot of anxiety about those losses. I think, therefore I am. We've probably heard that our whole life, that maxim. So if I think, therefore I am, that means, what if I have trouble thinking, or what if I stop thinking? Does that mean I'm no longer am? That I no longer am a being? So that's not really the Christian frame of how we look at humans, but that's floating in the air around us. And it creates a lot of fear. And like you say, Tyler, we hear it in the language we use, that people are suffering the long goodbye, that they're gone or lost or faded. And that language reflects our fear, but it also creates fear, because I don't want to be faded. I don't want to be gone while I'm still here. And so it kind of raises my blood pressure a little to hear that kind of language too. So part of the reason I wrote this book is to undermine that language. Like, are there other images we can use? Is there a gentler way to frame dementia other than heightened fear, stigma, and that you're losing yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our culture, we still have a very kind of like a Gnostic sense of what makes a human. Like we see a human as there's sort of this internal, eternal self surrounded by all of this flesh that kind of fades away. Um, and so, with our cultural understanding of what makes a human, when bodies fail, that kind of makes sense. But when we perceive that the internal self is leaving before the body, that messes with that paradigm that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
hard to reconcile with. So
It
you,
is.
oh, go ahead. Yeah,
No, yeah, I think you're right on. And we often talk about the mind as if it's something outside the body.
yeah,
But the brain is part of a whole, of our whole body. And so, um, you know, I don't want to be defined totally by my deficit. And if that deficit has to be in my brain, which it might be someday, I don't want to be wholly defined by that either. But we often do define people in these kind of narrow ways, like you're saying.
yeah. Well, you write about, your first day on the job at a retirement community, and a colleague was showing you around, around the facility, and took you to an entire floor that was dedicated to persons with dementia. And tell us about how they described that floor and how that kind of lit a fire in you.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, my first day and on this tour, and let me just say this: the administrator who gave me a tour, lovely person, not someone you would think harbors deep prejudice. And when we got to the fourth floor, the dementia unit, he said to me, "You know, you probably won't spend much time here." And the message was, with 200 people under my care, that it's probably best that I spend most of my time with people who will remember me once I leave, that I'll make my most impact in that way. And the subtle and not so subtle message is that these people aren't worth my time. They're not worth my best energy. And that's simply reflective of the wider culture, that often kind of shunts people with dementia and other disabilities kind of off to the side. And so at the time, if my spiritual intent is working correctly, I can, if it is, um, I can kind of sense or ask the question, why are people being dismissed when that kind of language comes up? And so at the time, I kind of wondered about that. And it usually says more about us than it does about the person with the deficit. Um, so I ended up spending most of my time, or more of my time, on that floor than any other. And what I came to discover is that these people I was encountering had such gifts to give. And they were individuals with individual histories and lives, and they had thriving spirits. But if we only look at them as disability or as a blur of sameness, then we don't really see it. And so what ended up happening is a woman on the floor, who always had a Bible in her lap. And I always wondered what to do. She just wheeled up and down with this Bible. I asked her if she wanted to start a Bible study. And she's a good evangelical. And so, of course, you know, more Bible studies, the better. And she and I started a Bible study. And we started just reading Genesis stories together. And from there, it took off and was a good 4 or 5 years before I left my ministry there. We had built up this group. She died by the end, and it became more of an interfaith group. But it was the highlight of my week, getting to be with these people with pretty severe dementia.
Could you recount for us the story of the woman that you discovered part of her history involved Harry Houdini? That was
Yeah.
fascinating.
I did a memorial service of a woman named Dorothy, who was the last surviving member of Houdini's stage act.
Mm.
She was 17 when he brought her on board. And she was at the retirement community where I served. And I think she was 103 when she died.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, encountering that story of her vanishing act was actually part of what she did with Houdini.
Yeah.
And then to kind of pair that with end of life, we all vanish.
Mm.
So we all have to deal with our own vanishing in a sense. And so I use that in the book as one sort of illustration that's maybe a little bit playful, but to get us thinking more broadly about vanishing. It's not just them, it's all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I loved that part. I thought that was a beautiful story. And one of the things that I just so loved about your book, Lynn, is that it was also very personal. It was personal about yourself, and we'll talk about this in a little bit about kind of the language we use for ourselves and the way you end the book. But woven throughout the book is the story of your family, and specifically your grandfather, Jack. And part of what I found interesting is that your grandfather Jack started to experience dementia as you were now being tasked with caring for these people, at this retirement community. And we all know that we hate to do our own yard work, but we'll do yard work at somebody else's house that's just fine. And so I'm curious about caring for the folks in this retirement community is one thing, but then this is your family.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that transition like, where you begin to kind of experience somebody that you didn't just hear stories about, you were part of that rich history prior to these moments. And so what was that like?
So as a chaplain, I sort of have the luxury of parachuting in to someone's life and am able to be present with them just as they are. I don't carry the history of having known them from a child or from young adulthood, or I don't know what they were. I know who they are now. And so I realized that it was much more difficult for families on the unit to do that. So I like to be able to kind of offer that gift, but I realized I could leave at 5 and family and other caregivers couldn't. And so it does create certainly a heightened awareness for me when it was in my own family of that kind of luxury to be able to come in and be present and leave. So with my own family, my grandfather, who spent the last decade of his life moving from facility to facility with worsening dementia, my mother, who was a primary caregiver, could not leave a unit at 5. She was sort of always on the clock. And I realized that creates a kind of exhaustion and something different from professional caregiving. And so I want to honor that for those, listening now, that I realize there is quite a bit of difference even between being a granddaughter and then the daughter. Yeah. So I'm still at a bit of a remove. But I can say that personal and professional do dovetail. I mean, there can't really be a high wall between that. I don't know if there should be. We want to bring our whole selves wherever we go. But with my grandfather, I did know him, for my whole life, and did carry those images of who he was, this luminescent physician and World War II pilot. I carried that with me every time I went in to see him, which created a layer of grief. But it also created a layer of opportunity where I could tell his stories, even when he couldn't. And so I could tell the story of when he landed his plane in Bombay, and I could tell that to his caregivers, and I could tell him his stories. And so there was not only grief, but also opportunity. And I found I felt closer to him in those final years than I had ever felt. getting to be with him in a way I'd never gotten to before, because he was always on the move. He was always traveling. He always had important things to do. And, not to make it just about me, but there was some sense I felt a connection with something about his being and his essence that I never had a chance to absorb before. So I'm grateful for those years, even as I grieve.
Yeah. Do you think it helped inform the way you dealt with those who loved your patients, or loved the folks that you worked with at the retirement community, kind of the surrounding peripheral family? I'm sure it gave you more empathy for what they were experiencing.
Yeah, a tremendous amount of respect. And at the time, I was living 1,000 miles from my mother and, my family. And so, there was a sense in which I had that connection, seeing them up close and having a greater understanding of what my mother was dealing with as well. Um, so of course, like all of life, it's a complicated palette of emotions, and I think we we can hold both sorrow and joy at the same time.
Mm. So in your current position, you're at Riverside Church. You said earlier, 1,600 members. I'm sure that Riverside is like a lot of congregations, in the West, and there is a healthy population of senior adults. And as minister with older adults, I know one of the questions that I received from folks at Ardmore, um, in a lot of different ways, was, what do you think congregations can do? Like, what can communities of faith do to care for uh, members who have dementia, and care for those who care for members with dementia?
Yeah, I think faith communities are uniquely positioned to be beacons of hope in this area. And why I say that is faith communities are by nature relational. And so we're already just like one step ahead, like the Connection Stephen ministries or whatever ministries are sort of hard baked in. It's relational by nature. And I think that's such a gift, and intergenerational by design. Even if sometimes that gets a little lopsided one way or the other, I think our churches are that's one of the greatest gifts. We have an ethic of care, that care is sacred, and that Jesus not only gave care, but received care himself. And I always love when the woman anoints him for burial and the disciples are like, send her away. And Jesus says, no, Jesus is a care receiver in that moment. And I think as Christians, we have those resources to say care is sacred, and our spaces are going to support whatever kind of care people need. Um, Churches also have rituals that are not just head trips, and we give people bread and wine or grape juice, Baptist life. um, we sing songs, hymns, and I'm sure many of you have stories of people who maybe had trouble talking or no longer were speaking in complete sentences, but could sing a hymn. Mm. And that's so deep. And that's what church is. We have those resources. So that's, first of all, just my plug to say, I think faith communities are where it's at in this and can lead the way. At Riverside, we started a memory cafe, and this is something other churches have done throughout the United States and in other parts of the country. And a memory cafe is very simple. It came from the Netherlands in the 90s, and it's a social gathering for people with dementia and those who love them. And it's non-stigma. So it's a non-stigma social environment. So there's no barrier between who has a diagnosis and who doesn't. We don't know. You come. You come as you are, and we play games and we eat chocolate and we have hot tea. So our last one before the pandemic hit, one of our participants, he had been a farmer. So here we are in Manhattan, and he's talking about having been a farmer, and he said he used to milk cows. And so we just pull up on YouTube how to milk a cow. And he taught us in that moment.
Oh,
And we just laugh. And so that's to say there's nothing rocket science about it. It's opening the doors, it's opening our hearts and willing to not relate to people based on disease. There are plenty of places that do that, and they need to. Physicians, Alzheimer's organizations relate to people based on disease stage and the clinical. Churches can offer something other than the clinical: laughter and joy and relationship and friendship. And so I think that's the charge I want to give any church. There's not a cookie cutter way to do it. I think this is a good start. Start saying dementia. Start praying for people who have dementia and those who love them in your services. Start lifting up their gifts. So it's not only that we're praying for you to pity you, but also to lift you up and say you're part of our community.
Yeah. So many people in our congregation, and as sort of the population of the United States continues to age, so many people find themselves in a really painful role reversal in their lives, where often the person that they love that has dementia is their parent. And they find themselves in this role reversal where now this person, where for decades was maybe a primary caregiver in their life, is now wholly reliant on them. And they often struggle with how to relate to that parent now because the dynamic is so shifted. And so how do you tend to counsel people as they kind of cope through this transition of the roles being reversed in their relationships?
Yeah, that's really, I'm glad you asked that. I think, first of all, affirm where people are at, affirm the grief that comes with that, the confusion, the sadness, the anger, the guilt, whatever it is. I think my first instinct is to always say, affirm that as real and that doesn't need to be fixed. Because some things in life are simply tragic, and we can name it as such. As Christians, we have a strong tradition of naming the tragic. I think the second thing I'd say is you're not alone. You're not the first person to have undergone this, although this is the first time for you, perhaps. So find safe people, find safe spaces that let you grieve, that let you cry, that let you laugh without judgment. Because I think community and being able to do that kind of free like expression and work is so important. So support groups at Riverside, we try to connect people with dementia caregiver support groups for just this kind of question. I think if I could zoom back a little bit, I also want to say, for all of us, not just people, adult children caring for parents, but for all of us, if we can begin to ask what remains intact for people and lead with, instead of deficit, what are the gifts and strengths. And I don't say that to be Pollyanna or to say that there isn't, deficit. But if we can start asking the question, what are the gifts this person wants to give and how can I facilitate them? And so we often get in this pattern of, I'm going to care for you and I'm going to give to you. And it's easy pattern to get into, but what does this person want to give to me? And so as a chaplain, I would always accept gifts. Now, of course, not like cash gifts or anything, but I would always, whatever someone wanted to give me, I would take it. So if they wanted to give me a cookie, I would take it and eat it in front of them. And I just I took that from Henry Nouwen, actually, the Catholic priest who worked with people with disability, and he said, always take the gifts. So whatever those gifts are, to be able to create a space to receive them. So I want to kind of turn the question a little bit to a common frame that's often used with people with dementia is that they are in reverse, human development in reverse. So you might hear people say that people with dementia are becoming children again. It's a common, and it describes some of the behaviors you see. But I think it's not a particularly helpful frame to talk about people becoming children again. Because the fact is that these are adults. And if we begin to treat adults like children or infants, it can create kind of a downward spiral of condescension and not honoring the fullness of their humanity. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Yeah. Sounds like to to retain the label of reciprocity in the relationship, even as the roles reverse. And obviously, as you acknowledged, there is, a drastic changed need at the heart of the relationship, but to keep that sense of reciprocity, of mutuality, in how you care for one another. I really think that's beautiful.
And I can remember a son who would come to the dementia unit and, just thinking about new gifts that emerge. And he said his mother was never affectionate. She wasn't particularly nurturing or outwardly loving. And as her dementia progressed, she began to shower him with love and kisses and affection.
Mm.
And for him, it was such a joy. And he would just sort of laugh about it. Like, I can't believe this. Here I am, 55, and I'm getting kisses from my mom that I never got. And it's those kinds of things I just don't want us to skip past.
Yeah.
And to really hold and look for.
Yeah. Well, for those joining on Zoom, I want to remind you that if you have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll look at those in just a little bit. But I have one more question I want to ask from me, Lynn, and I think that, as I read your book, so much of it was about the power of language, the power of how the symbols we use, almost anthropologically, the symbols that we use defines reality for us. And I think maybe the most compelling part of the book for me was at the very end, where you encourage us to change the way we speak about dementia in our own lives, and how to stop using the phrase if I get dementia, and to adopt the phrase when I have dementia. And how do you think that change in semantics shapes us? And what are other ways that language has the power to help us maybe be more empathic towards those with dementia, which you've already mentioned a few this evening?
Yeah. Well, Tyler, nothing has been more of a conversation piece than that part of the book. People either strongly identify with it or they strongly push back against the idea of saying when I have dementia. And so I want to be clear that it's not inevitable that people will get dementia as they get older. It's certainly not a reality for everyone, or even the majority of people who are older. So I'm not making a clinical statement. I'm making, like you say, an anthropological, kind of theological statement that if we begin to name a reality, it can take some of the fear out of it. if we shift from saying if to when, it puts it, for me at least, on a human spectrum. It puts dementia on the spectrum of things that can happen to you because you're human. It doesn't make you less human. It doesn't make you less loved. It is part of the experience that could be part of your future or your loved one's future or your neighbor. So for me, it helps lower the anxiety a little, lower the temperature a little bit. And I also have probably a strong genetic component to the fact that that might be part of my future. And so I want to remove some of the stigma and the denial around it as well. Words matter. We know that. Christians, in the beginning was the word. Words matter. So they're not just something we say, and we know that. We know that if someone misnames us or uses a hurtful name for us, we carry that with us. Just as if someone names us their beloved, we carry that with us. And so words, I think, especially for Christians, have the weight of glory. I mean, the weight of God. It really helps create our worlds around us. So I encourage us to, in whatever ways we can, even if you're not comfortable saying when I have dementia, if we can even get comfortable with saying people living with dementia instead of Alzheimer's sufferers, or people are demented, there are people living with dementia, that they're actually survivors. They're not sufferers. And if we can begin to use the language of gifts and care and love, as opposed to diminishment and fading, we begin to create a world that we want to live in as we age.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've gotten a number of questions, and I don't think we're going to get to all the questions, but I want to ask a few of them. And some of it's stuff that we've kind of already touched on a little bit. But one question from my friend Joyce is, what conversation topics should be included or be avoided with maybe friends or people that we love who are in the early stages of dementia? And I think she's wondering, how do we care for people who have an awareness that this is coming in their lives?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that, a number of surveys have been out that show that 1 in 3 people, after receiving a diagnosis of dementia, lose friends. That's pretty startling. And over 1/3 of people with dementia report feeling lonely. So I think my instinct to say to this person, I'm sorry, I forgot her name. Joyce?
Joyce.
Joyce. Yeah, Joyce. I think the first thing I'd like to say is, instead of worrying too much about making mistakes or saying the wrong thing or asking the wrong question, the fact that you're there, the fact that you care, you're going to remain a friend, you're going to continue to pray. So I would say worry less about, I might offend this person, and instead worry more about just sticking with them. And if you make a mistake, like with anyone, oh, I'm sorry, I care about you. And so I can't necessarily say do X, Y, and Z, but I would say don't make it a stigmatized topic. Doesn't mean you always have to talk about it. But if the person has told you they have a diagnosis, just as if they told you they had a diagnosis of heart disease or diabetes, you wouldn't talk about it every time you see them, but it also wouldn't be a taboo. Yeah. And so I think, feel free to talk about it, but take your cues from them, and them better than anyone as their friend. So just keep being a friend, and let grace kind of catch us when we when we don't get it right.
Yeah, Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, Joyce. So this is a question from Donna. She says, "How do you help a person with dementia see that what they think is a thought from God is not from God?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Thought from God is not a thought from God. Well, I have to say, first of all, arguing doesn't tend to work because the person isn't willfully coming up with things in order to provoke you. I know it may seem like that sometimes, that someone's like offering this falsehood that clearly, if I just give them more information, they will see this is wrong. And I think oftentimes with people who are having difficulty thinking, it's these ideas are not ones that can be argued out of. And so we often have to, I think, enter the reality the best we can. And as the improv artists say, you have to sort of yes and it. So you have to kind of affirm the scene and then maybe add a little bit more. Now, with questions of God, I'm not sure exactly what this person is saying, but if there's a way to listen for maybe what's below it, if it's anxiety or if it's a sense of peace, maybe to affirm that feeling, to affirm the fact that you're there and you love them, that maybe you're having trouble understanding, if you're having trouble understanding, as opposed to they're confused. Instead of you're confused, I'm having a little difficulty understanding. I'm sorry that I can't get it. I really want to get it, and I'm sorry I can't, but I love you and I'm here for you. I think is sometimes the most important thing we can say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. My friend Kim asked about something called inside out music therapy. And I think, I mean, have you had any experience with inside out music therapy, or maybe just music therapy with people with dementia? And how have you utilized that, or how have you seen that in maybe your work?
Oh, great. Kim, I'd love to hear about this particular brand. I have seen it, different forms of music therapy. Maybe this one I'd love to learn more about. I want to steer people toward a documentary called Alive Inside. It's it's an incredible journey through what music can do with people with severe dementia. And I believe the program is Memory Makers. But yeah, I don't think we can underestimate how important music is
Mm.
for reaching those parts of our brain, of our souls, of ourselves that unlocks such positive feelings, memories, connection to community. So I think the best music therapy I know of is to know the person, know their preferences. My grandfather hated country music, and so they would always play it in his dining room, and we would, try to like insert a little jazz and big band in there. But yeah, know the person, use music, and yeah, just in some ways enjoy the play of what art can unleash in us and what music does for our souls.
Yeah.
Sing with the person, sing together.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple questions that I've gotten that have attached sort of the diminishment of the way that we see people with dementia with kind of other uh, often controversial issues in our world. Um, and I'm curious, kind of as a pastor, I'd love to hear maybe your theology about how we retain just the innate dignity in in everybody, regardless of the conditions by which we usually define them. And if you could just
Mhm.
kind of give that a little bit, I'd love to hear that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, because we're intersectional. by nature, so when we're talking about dementia, it's going to have these overlaps with any group that's pushed to the margins. So I always gravitate toward Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, and Jesus's call for us to minister to the least of these, because by ministering to the least of these, we are ministering unto Christ. And so that's a pretty radical suggestion, that by ministering to those persons who have been marginalized in our society, we're not just doing a nice thing. We're not just being like great altruistic people. No, we're actually ministering to Christ, Christ's self. So that's a pretty radical thing. And so I guess I root my theology there in a sense, that it's me who benefits from ministering to Christ in some ways, that we're diminished when we, as a community, not include these people, that we're actually less than. And so I mourn for communities that don't embrace, my LGBTQ brothers and sisters, siblings. I mourn for those communities that don't embrace people in the full spectrum of their lives, because I think we're diminished when we don't.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that gets into what the person was talking about with other societal issues, but for me, that comes up pretty strongly.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question is, I think this is a really interesting question, is, when you talk about changing our language to kind of when I get dementia, to sort of making that shift in our lives and in our language. My friend Kim asked, should we be doing something special for planning for those stages of our lives? And specifically, she asked, what about maybe people who are single, who will not have, children to kind of come in and take on those routine responsibilities?
That's a great question. Something I think about a lot as a childless person myself. And I think, again, churches are uniquely positioned in this way. There's a program at a synagogue near Riverside called Community as Family. And it was founded by a woman who is aging without children and realizes dementia may be in her future. And so she has gathered a group that meets every month at her synagogue to be as family to one another on this aging journey. And so I'm excited to try to do something like that at Riverside if that's where the Spirit moves. But I think that churches are great places to do that, to begin being very practical on one hand. Maybe we put together, our wills and paperwork and gather resources on that, but that we are also mindful of the ways that we can create communities of care and not become so individualistic, which is always the magnetic pull of our culture toward the individual, toward the nuclear family. But as Christians, we have this resource that we're in the kinship of God. And so blood ties is not all there is. So I'm excited by models like Community as Family.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So another question, for caregivers of parents experiencing increasing signs of dementia, this is from my friend Karen, who are the best people to help the caregivers decide when more professional help is required, such as when it is time to go into residential care, or when to seek counselors or medical doctors or social workers?
Yeah. Wow, that's, I hesitate. I'm not a clinician, but I'll just say, from my experience, sometimes your local Alzheimer's Association are just the most untapped resource. They're sitting there waiting with all this experience to receive calls to help people navigate this terrain. So I advise, first of all, your local chapters of your Alzheimer's organization is often a really, really great resource for these kinds of things. Your primary care physician, if you have geriatricians, which are, there's such a shortage, such a shortage. They're often, very adept at handling these things. Geriatric social workers as well, which are in short supply, but if you can find those kind of people who do it every day. But I recommend starting with your local Alzheimer's groups are really going to be able to probably steer you in the right direction for those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. There's already really good resources in the community. That's wonderful. Yeah. Um, my friend Mike asked, you have a lot to say about children dealing with a parent with dementia. What do you say who is also a caregiver?
Yeah, thank you. Right. Because I think it seems as if most caregiving is actually intragenerational.
Right.
There's the intergenerational, but the intragenerational too. And I think, spouses are often there 24/7. So are in it. I think it's really important that there's community involved and that sometimes the partner, the spouse, becomes subjected to shared stigma. And so as they're caregiving for the person, that because it's kind of a stigmatized disease, that the spouse begins to be isolated as well. And so I think anything the community can do, the church can do to continue to stay connected with those partnerships and not only treat them as, one person with dementia, one person without. Yes, that's important, but also as a couple, that they remain a partnership, and that deserves to be honored as well, I think is really important. But again, I think anything to affirm and assure and to connect with a broader sense of you're not doing this alone and you don't have to, and it's not humane to ask you to, is important.
And I'm so intrigued by, and this is me now just speaking as pastor of Ardmore, that thinking about what we can do as a community of faith. And obviously, this is a post pandemic activity, but that idea of a memory cafe, that's so beautiful to me and so intriguing. And I think that's something that we can do. And it sounds like that's also a good opportunity for both the spouse of somebody with Alzheimer's and the person themselves. And so I love that idea, and I'm gonna mull that over for a while. Well, Lynn,
Yeah.
I so appreciate you taking the time. And what I thought about as I read your books, I thought about this is probably going to sound cheesy and pastory, like I automatically went to some scripture passage, but I thought about Ecclesiastes and how the writer of Ecclesiastes really it is not a cheery book at all, and it's really about accepting the inevitability of what will happen to us in life, not in a glass half empty pessimistic sort of way, but in a only when you accept it can you then find meaning within it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's how your book kind of struck me, is that we spend the other day when I was looking up like questions to ask you, just doing a random Google search, I found at least 10 TED Talk like things where somebody was telling me if I live my life in a certain way now, I can avoid dementia later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there's very little science to back up any of that. So there's an acceptance that comes with it that I think leads us to greater kind of personal and social, spiritual health. And so I just want to thank you for that. That's one of the things that I really got out of it. Um, A couple comments from our folks that are watching on YouTube, Lynn, is my friend Becky just simply wants to thank you and thank you for pointing out how different it is to interact with family members with dementia versus interacting with others you've known for shorter times. And then she also says, thanks also for encouraging that we accept gifts from those with dementia. It's too easy to see only what you are giving, not what they can offer in return. And so I think that resonated with Becky quite a bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Becky, for lifting that up.
So Lynn, any final words you want to offer to us before we go?
Wow, you've really fed my soul today, and people have such beautiful questions. And Tyler, I appreciate you lifting up Ecclesiastes. And I think as Christians, we have the tools to deal with the tragic. We worship, we follow a Christ crucified. We don't have to shy away. We can go through the tragic, and we know new life is on the other side. And I don't mean that in some kind of like far off distant way, but that we live that in cycles of our lives as we go, and to learn to deepen our trust in not avoiding the tragic, but to move through it, and to move through it as a community is our greatest hope. Jesus didn't do it alone, and we don't have to either. So the subject of dementia, I know it is scary, and I can't say I've overcome it at all. Part of this book is me working through my fear and working with it. And one of my greatest hopes is that faith communities can come on board and do the best that we can, that we think about shifting our culture at a language level, at a values level, that we value each person as made in the image of God, and that doesn't change from womb to tomb. And as we move forward, that we're able to say the words dementia in the same sentence that we say the word gift. And so I wish you all blessings on this journey. And if I can be a part of it in any way going forward, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's been good to reconnect with you and hear your wisdom. And I do want to encourage, I know some of you, a couple of people texted me while we were talking, Lynn, and said, my book is, the post office, I can't find my book and I wish I would have it. So I know that it's coming for some folks, but I can't recommend this highly enough to all of us. None of us will escape somebody that we love experiencing dementia, and it may be us. It is likely to be us, honestly. And so I'm grateful for this resource. I'm grateful for you and the time that you've given to us, Lynn. And I do want to let everybody know that our next Conversations That Matter is going to be in a couple months, and you'll get more information about that soon. But the book that we'll be looking at is called The Bible and Borders. It's by a Hebrew Bible scholar named Daniel Carroll, who is Guatemalan. And it is about what Scripture says about our care for the immigrants and care for the way that we talk about issues such as immigration in our own community. And so we'll be engaging in dialogue about that. So Lynn, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being part of this.
Thank you so much. And love to Ardmore. Ryan and I went to Ardmore. We got to experience Rick Jordan's Sunday school class. And so anyway, love Ardmore.
So if somebody really disagrees with anything that you said tonight, it's really Rick Jordan's fault, is what I heard.
It's Rick,
Yeah. He is a menace.
Back there.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, no.
Well, give my love to Ryan, and thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Take care.
All right. Yep. Bye, everybody.